Okay, it's always safe to start a new video, right? So repetition is sort of another way of saying rehearsal, but sometimes repetition can be imposed on you. Like we may make you do the same activity over and over and over again as a requirement, not because you're voluntarily rehearsing, but because we're making you do it. And that would be what we're calling repetition, right? So if you have what we call massed repetition, where you have repeated presentations that occur closely together in time. It doesn't have to be immediately, but it could be, within the same day or within the same hour, something like that. You get less reliable memory than if you do a distributed repetition pattern where you have repeated presentations spread out over time. And ideally, it's spread out over, several hours or several days. Having the same basic material repeated. It's a good idea, for example, in a class that you might be taking where the teacher kind of recaps what happened in the last meeting, just a little, remember we were talking about X, now let's move on to Y kind of thing. That kind of repeated presentation will add to memorability. Distributed practice is always better. Students a lot of times I was a student and I have to say I did not have the world's greatest study habits going into college. I really didn't. Really didn't learn how to study until probably my senior year. Um, I had a lot going on in my defense, right? I was commuting 30 miles each way to get to campus. I was working full time to pay for my own tuition. It was a lot. And so something had to give, and it tended to be actually reading my textbook for a course. I never missed class. I have to say that I did attend every time, unless like I absolutely could not because of illness or something. Otherwise I was always in class. So I did have that kind of distributed rehearsal. But one problem with class time is that the teacher usually doesn't repeat themselves. They usually are just forging forward and just moving forward all the time. And so you don't get a lot of repeated presentations just by attending class. Much better strategy is to read a little bit every day and then kind of review it right before the exam. So what I learned to do by my senior year in college, and remarkably better grades as a result of doing this, by the way, was that I stopped trying to highlight my textbooks. I realized it was hopeless. My textbooks were turning out yellow with all this highlighter that I was putting into my textbooks. And I wasn't really remembering anything anyway, so why was I even doing it? And I wouldn't get through all the chapters because I would read it like my life depended on it. And so that's not a great strategy. Much better strategy is to say to yourself, it's, it's hard today in modern times where you can pick up your phone and start scrolling reels. Um, don't do that. Anytime you have free time, pick up your textbook and read it like it's interesting. Don't read it with a intent to highlight anything. Just read it like it's a book. Um, some of you enjoy reading for pleasure anyway. Some of you don't as much, but those who do like reading for pleasure, read it like it's interesting. Read it because you remember stuff from the books that you read for pleasure and you don't highlight those. So just read the book as if it's interesting and do it all the time. Any moment that you have just 15 minutes of free time, pick up your book, go through and look at the major terms of the last section that you read and then read a new section. And just read it. Don't highlight it, just read it. And next time you have a little bit of time, go back and look at the key words from the last section that you read and move forward, just reading it like it's interesting. I think you'll find that you get through your book that way and you actually remember a lot of your book. You will remember the concepts. Spreading it out like that makes it much more memorable. And see how in that little piece of advice, I just accidentally might have tricked you into reading it twice, right? Because you read it and then you went back and looked at the keywords the next time you picked it up and then read the next section. I'm actually going to try and advise you maybe to, on your third pass through right before the exam, just focusing in, like in my class, I give you a study guide. So just focus in on those terms that you know are going to be on the exam, right? And just review what the textbook said about those. So I've actually kind of told you're going to look at it 3 times. But if you were to do that very painlessly, You're not sitting there drudgery massed presentation where you say to yourself, I have to read this entire chapter in this sitting or I'm never going to get through all this material. If instead you just do a section at a time, review the last one, read the next one, just like that, and kind of do it with that sort of airy, breezy approach, you're going to remember a lot more material than if you do the massed. It's what we call the spacing effect. The spacing effect says that if you space out your practice, you will perform better than if you try and do it all in one big massed session. So that crazy studying right before an exam doesn't produce the kind of memory that distributing it out across time will do. Now, having said all that, if you're like me and you didn't get the distributed practice in, of course, massed is better than nothing, right? Like, at least get your study guide, at least go through it, try and prepare yourself, the night before. But, any amount of rehearsal is going to be better than none. But just if you are starting now, start distributing it out. Now, the distinctiveness hypothesis, and I've talked a little bit already about things being distinctive. The distinctiveness hypothesis says that how well information can be distinguished from other items that are being encoded and or other items that are already stored in long-term memory, the better you will remember that material. So if you can do something with incoming information to make it unique and different from the other things that you're trying to encode at the same time, that's going to benefit you. If you can help to distinguish between the subtle differences between these two things that are already stored in long-term memory, that's going to help you to keep those separate come exam time or in reality when you maybe need to use that information on the fly. If you have a distinctive code tied to those cues, you're going to remember a lot better. Von Restorff discovered this back in 1933. He found that items in different colored font were remembered better than items in the same font. So he made the argument that having, some stuff in green and in 1933, textbooks did not have a lot of color in them. They were basically just solid black. There wasn't bold, there wasn't italics. It was just, solid text. He argued that if you can highlight things like you see how the spacing effect and the testing effect are in bold font, bold green font, sticking out like that, you'll also notice there's the use of some italics in this piece that I pulled for you. When you can distinguish these items, it helps to hop out from the rest of the font and helps you to latch on to it in your memory. So your memory may include the fact that this was in bold green font or that this was in italics, right? And that can help you to have like enough distinctive code that you can sort of separate out the concept of the spacing effect from the concept of distributed practice and massed practice. Because see, the spacing effect is like the overarching thing. Distributed practice and massed practice are sort of under that, right? And you can start to organize the information, keeping them distinct from each other so that it's more meaningful in the long run and more memorable. All right. These are some pictures that I used in my dissertation research because I was really interested in the fact that people tend to remember pictures better than they remember words. So imagery is very memorable. Here we have images that were generated for us, nice line drawings that somebody made of these different objects. Imagery can also include times that you're visualizing something in your head. So you're generating the image yourself. You can imagine if you generate the image yourself, it's going to be more memorable than if you just have an image presented to you, because if you generate it yourself, you get the generation effect benefit, don't you? You also might get distinctiveness benefits where you generate an image that is different from other images that you already have stored in your memory. So a lot of the things we've already been talking about applies to images as well. So the reason why pictures tend to be better remembered than words is because of what is called the dual code hypothesis. If a particular type of material can be coded both visually and verbally, that's going to provide two codes for enhanced retrieval. When you go to look for that item to try and remember what was on the list or whatever, you can either go look in your visual storage for memories, or you can go look in your verbal storage for memories. You have both of those things. If you're going to go along the levels of processing model, and you say, what would be a deep process? I'm going to throw out that visualizing the content is going to be a very deep process. It's good. The research has already shown that it's better than judging whether the items rhyme. So if you can imagine the stimulus, it's going to be better remembered than if you are merely judging whether it rhymes. There's some question about whether it's better than judging it for pleasantness or whether it fits into a particular sentence or something. Um, in my research, which is unpublished, so don't take it too seriously, but in my research, consistently, the we had a visual benefit. Especially if you generated your own image. Uh, Now, if I showed you pictures like these and asked you to label them, you remembered them better than if I didn't tell you to label them. So it looks like you really do need both codes, and it is not necessarily the case that people will spontaneously label visual cues. So if I tell the participant to label it, then they'll say boot and coat and so on. And then they do remember that list better. But if I don't tell them that and they are just doing some other task and I don't ask them to label it, you don't necessarily see picture superiority over judging for pleasantness or something like that. All right, I'm going to stop here and we're going to talk about some mnemonic devices in the next segment.